Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Jones,
And I'm Rita Mochandi.
and we both work with Man Global Health, and we've been helping the Reproductive Health Supplies Coalition develop a menstrual health product policy simulation and equity tool. We're here today to use this tutorial to introduce how to navigate through the tool itself. So Rita and I are going to walk you through the Excel-based spreadsheet, but first I wanted to share a few of the resources that are available with the tool itself. So the menstrual health product policy simulation and equity tool really aims to help policymakers and stakeholders navigate tax reform to improve product affordability and equitable access. Really, we were asked by the RHSC to answer the question, what are the impacts of tax reforms on the affordability and access of menstrual health products? So this work really aims to estimate how any changes in tax policy or reform impact retail prices for the end user. That includes issues like affordability and equitable access across income groups. So the policy simulation approach was applied in Kenya and India and was leveraged to develop insights and build out a model to estimate potential income. So again, we're looking at how do we understand when tax reforms are made, the impact on affordability, equity, choice for the end user, and access. Now, the tool itself really models how taxes and import duties and paratariffs flow through the value chain to customer retail prices. It estimates the proportion of costs of any change that is made upstream through policy levels and what passes through or reaches the end user. It also analyzes affordability across income groups to support an equity lens and compares benefits to low income users versus fiscal costs to the governments itself. So the full report is included on the RHSC website. They are currently developing a landing page that will take you to all of these tools itself. That landing page is still under development. So for the time being, if you can just type in menstrual health product policy simulation and equity tool, you should be able to land on all of these resources. But it's important to review these resources before viewing this video. So if you haven't looked at these materials, stop, go review the report, which introduces the underlying concepts as well as the case studies as we applied the tool and approach in India and Kenya, as I said, and really begins to introduce and unpack some of the concepts underpinning the tool itself. So those concepts are really fundamental to understanding and using the tool itself. Additional resources included in this suite of tools include a lit review and key informant interview analysis report, which reflects all of the insights that we gathered by reviewing existing literature globally, as well as having a number of key informant interviews with experts in the field, as well as country level experts to really underpin some of the insights that we developed. And finally, there is a comprehensive framework approach and methodology document, which really goes into detail the underlying concepts, the ideas, and the approach that we applied to coming up and developing the tool itself. So I encourage you, in fact, implore you, again, before going into the Excel-based tool, review these documents. We also have recorded a number of webinars that are also available on the website that provide some additional context. So stop and view those materials as well. But this video aims to specifically introduce the tool itself. So here you should be looking at the landing page for the tool. Going to try and expand the size of it, which I cannot do, but I hope you can see it. So you should land first on the worksheet summary. So this is an Excel-based tool. There are a number of inputs that are required by the end user. That's based on the analysis that you may have used. Rita and I are going to talk you through each one of these worksheets and are aiming to derive and help you understand. Um, but this is the landing page kind of is like a table of contents or an overview of the work itself, including a glossary, which I'll walk through in a second, a worksheet that has the input assumptions, a worksheet that includes inputs for taxes and fees, a worksheet that includes cost stacks for both imported products as well as locally produced products, scenarios that the user can use to run through any changes in tax policy and any potential reforms. Um, and then finally, the results and what actually passes through, or we would estimate to pass through to the end user um, based on this. So this worksheet is just here an orientation to the tool itself. Overview introduces at a very high level the uses for the tool and the applications and the key outputs that you would expect to achieve. Key outputs, I will say, include right now, there's a baseline for each cost stack for both imported and local products. So you will understand how costs build throughout the value chain for both imported as well as locally produced products. There's a key output includes scenario testing, which includes toggles to test shifts in tax regimes, such as moving from VAT standard to zero rated and to exempt. And again, I encourage you to go back to the full webinar as well as some of the resources to understand the differences, the nuanced differences of how VAT works and zero rating and the differences with exemption. There's a pass-through engine which really aims to help us understand in both formal markets as well as informal markets how any changes in costs impact the end user. We look at affordability across income quintiles to understand an important key element here of what is actually affordable to the end user or not. And then there's the benefit to cost ratio, which I'll talk about in greater detail in just a bit. There is a work page here which introduces key terms that are important to understanding this. And again, it complements the full report itself. Um, so it is a quick resource as you move through the tool and you forget or need to understand or clarify what some of these core terminology mean. You can reference this as well. And then finally, we get to, I shouldn't say finally, the key element of this, the tool itself is the input assumptions. So this is where most of the data that a user will use to import core data from their specific market that the tool will then use to compute through and model specific changes. I'll run through some of the core inputs that drive the engine itself. I'm not going to go into great detail into the concepts underpinning that because, again, that is outlined in the full report. I will go down to the bottom of the worksheet as well, because this section at the bottom is repeated on each worksheet, and it does provide the user with an idea of what the worksheet does, how to use it in terms of where data can be imported or not, key elements in the data that are needed, a summary of that, and potential data sources and guiding elements. And again, it has a refresher for some of the key concepts. Here, we're talking about market concentration and how that impacts the user as well. So going back up to the top of the worksheet, the core columns and the way that we've organized this, there's a general category of what is the data it is that we're calculating, what the value is for that element, and some of the sources and assumptions that the user can then write in. What we're going to show you is specific data that we use to calculate for Kenya generally, although in some cases we've made a generic attempt in terms of some of the assumptions behind it, like in particular around VAT, that will help, I think, just clarify how the tool works and how it applies specifically in Kenya. So the first category of data that you're going to need is the total number of menstruating individuals in any country. That data is available, I should say, a shortcut for that is on the LEAP report on the RHSC website. It's a great report, great resource for a lot of the data that will be used to input into this tool itself. Next, we have the number of women in the lowest three income quintiles. This is going to be particularly important when we get into estimates over number of products used by lower income populations as well as relative equity measures. For the example of Kenya, we use the bottom three of five income quintiles. In some countries, you may use the bottom two of five or the bottom one of five. Again, this is relative and it should be driven by the needs of the specific country itself and bringing in the general context into play for each one of these elements. We have the estimated total market value of all products, menstrual health products that are sold in a particular country. In Kenya, we were fortunate to have access to data from the Euromonitor. If you don't have access from market reports, it can be a bit more challenging to estimate that. The report goes into greater detail of how you might be able to estimate some of that. We have the estimated number of purchased units for lower income as well as higher income individuals. Again, this is going to be important for equity measures. And the total number of products that we estimate to be sold in a year. Currency exchange rate is an important figure. And again, getting down into estimating income quintiles, these are going to be important for equity measures. Estimating incomes by quintile can be quite challenging, so play with the data, go to commonly available websites like the World Bank. In Kenya, in particular, we used household budget surveys, which was recently done and provides some fairly rich and granular data by quintile of what households will spend overall, which we use to estimate what their average income was, which then again was a driver for relative affordability. The average single-use products used per month, this is data assumptions that we took from the LEAP report again, but we also have it in play um, partial use, where we estimate that a menstruator might use or have access to just half the number of recommended products per month or needed in a month throughout the menstrual cycle. And that is, again, reflect the reality that we know exists in many countries, especially for lower income people. Um, we have estimated imported costs. CIF is the imported cost per single-use unit we estimated that at 25 shillings, and that was based on key informant interviews, market data, market observations. But we also looked at higher cost products as well, again, to provide some a range of affordability measures across users, and also to try and understand how any shifts in policy might play out differently for higher cost products versus lower cost products. And finally, we have local manufacturing cost of goods sold data that we've really is an important component of this because one of the key findings of our work is that the way that domestically produced products varies quite significantly and differently from imported products, which is an important measure and an element to understand. The affordability threshold that we came up based on review of the literature is subjective, but we did come up with 0.5%. That is half of 1% of an individual's average monthly income. If they were expected to spend that on menstrual health products, is what we deemed as affordable. Now, again, highly subjective. The user is welcome to change that, and that will flow through to the affordability benchmarks. But this reflects some data that we have that encompasses both higher income as well as lower income countries and relative affordability. Informal sector share of purchases is a really key and important component of this work, as well as formal sector pass-through and informal sector pass-through and market concentration. All of those really influence to the extent that any shifts in policy changes will flow through to the end user. Those concepts, there's a lot to unpack there. I encourage you to go back to the report and understand what market concentration is and why it's important, the idea of formal versus informal markets, and how those relate and tie into cost pass-throughs. The final element here for input is trade markup. So this is again was derived from key informant interviews and market observations as well as experience. And these are the markups that we would expect in addition to specific costs that are going into a product at each stage of the value chain. So for importer markups, we estimate that as 10%, distributor, wholesaler, and retailer. There's a certain specific element of markup. This is going to vary by market and by country. They are estimates, but we try to come up with the best estimate possible, again, to derive estimates of what we would expect pass-through to be. I'm going to hand it off to Rita, who's going to talk next about input sheet for taxes and fees, which is really the other major sheet where we're importing data into to derive our estimates for what pass-through might be.
Okay, so alongside the input assumption spreadsheet that Chris has just presented, the taxes and fees spreadsheet is yet another foundational worksheet that you will require to fill out, and this will give you a reference point in regards to the taxes, para-tariffs, and certification costs that are applicable in your own country, and that will be extremely useful in calculating the cost stack for both imported and locally manufactured products. And then down the line, it will also help you model different policy scenarios just to see how those have an effect on what kind of effect they have on the final end product or the retail prices. So in this particular worksheet, it's a major input worksheet, and you're open to making any adjustments that you may be applicable in your country. We have divided this into two sections: finished goods and locally manufactured goods, and this is because taxes and costs play out differently between the two categories. So that's important so that we are able to work out the cost stack with realistic data. So maybe if I could just go a little bit into detail in what you're seeing in the percentages that you're seeing. You will begin by entering. So I'm looking at the finished goods section. This is the first section that will appear on this spreadsheet. So under finished good, you will see that the first thing that you will be required to enter is the standard VAT rate for your country as it stands now. An example for Kenya is 16%. And then in the next tab, you will be required to enter the treatment, the VAT treatment for your specific country. And if Chris, you can toggle around that, you will see that there are three options that are available. So you either have exempt, standard, or zero rated. So pick the one that is applicable to your specific context. It is going to have implications downstream as you begin to calculate the scenarios and the affordability spreadsheets. Once you've done that, then you jump into the taxes and para-tariffs. We have entered the two taxes that are applicable where we stand in Kenya. So there's the excise tax and the import tax. If there are any applicable taxes in those two areas, then feel free to manually change that or add, because this is really a foundational worksheet, add any other tax that we have not captured here. Then after that, you jump into the para-tariffs. The ones that are applicable for Kenya is import declaration fee, railway development levy, and the maritime shipping levy, and the associated percentages across each. Then the next area that would be critical for you to collect data on is any certification costs that are applicable in your country context. For our case, we have either the destination inspection certification that is at the port of entry when the goods come into the country, or for Kenya, really what happens is that there's the pre-export verification conformity certification that happens at the factory at the country of origin. So again, put in whatever proportion works or is applicable within your own context, and where that certification cost occurs. So when we jump into the next tab, you see the locally manufactured goods. Again, we are collecting the same data. So some taxes may apply in the locally manufactured that may not apply in the imported. So that's why we have the two differentiations. I think what's fundamentally different on this particular section is the input VAT recoverable. If Chris, you could highlight on that. So that will once you select the VAT treatment for the locally manufactured product, then the recoverable the worksheet is going to automatically pick up whether VAT is recoverable or not recoverable based on what you select. So if you select exempt, if you select zero rated, yes, the VAT is recoverable. If you select exempt, then the VAT is not recoverable. So I think one other important thing to add is that this specific data on taxes and paratariffs is available in the public domain for our case. And we pulled out a lot of this data from the websites of the Kenya Revenue Authority and the Kenya Bureau of Standards. And then what we did is that we went back to them just to verify that the published data is really what's happening in a live situation. But we also had extensive discussions with key informants just to understand from the manufacturer's point of view or from the importer's point of view whether this is their lived experience and this is what they are paying at the port of entry. So we are now on the cost stack worksheet, and this is where the model begins to make various calculations. Again, we have separated the cost stack for imported pads and for locally manufactured pads, and that's because there are different taxes and different ways within which both products go through the value chain and through the market that are significantly different. So we wanted to separate that so that you can begin to see how the costs stack. So on this particular worksheet, you are not required to enter any data manually. It's pulling off the foundational worksheets that we've previously shared. So that's the input assumptions and the taxes and fee assumptions. And they translate here. So the first section of this spreadsheet begins by giving you an overview of the price per pack. Chris had mentioned it was 25 shillings for an imported pad. That's the lower end pad, and then 55 shillings for the high end pad. And then it pulls the tax data that is applicable from the previous slide that I have presented. Again, this is really, this just offers a reference point as you begin to work through the cost stack, so that you're seeing, as you calculate through the cost stack, you can see some of the applicable data without having to go back to the foundational spreadsheets. So the taxes, and then we also put in the markups as Chris had presented them in the earlier worksheet. So the second section of this worksheet begins now to do the cost stack calculations for an imported pad. It's working for both low-end and high-end products. Those are the two columns that you can see. And it begins by working out any duties that are applicable. So import duty, it shows it's 0 for both high-end and low-end. So that means that import duty has been removed for this specific scenario or hypothesis that we are working with. It goes down to calculate what proportion of the landed at port cost is for a packet of 8 across the various paratariffs. If there are any other, certification costs that are applicable, again, it shows what the absolute number is in regards to Kenya shillings that are added to the cost of the landed product at the port of entry. And once all that calculation is done, then you get your landed cost. Chris, if you could just highlight the landed cost. So you get your landed cost after the So the landed cost here, so being 29 shillings. So if you'll recall that the CIF cost for a low-end product was 25. After adding the taxes and the para-tariffs and certification percentages, it comes to 29 shillings for a low end, and from 55 shillings or for a high end, it lands at 64 shillings for a pack of 8. So once you have the landed cost, the last section of this spreadsheet now begins to build in the distribution markups. And again, Chris had spoken about the distribution markups. These are really not, they're estimates, but these are highly credible, because these are the percentages that we got from our importers when we spoke with them, and also from the market observations and what the final product costs at the retail outlet. So we add up we take up the landed cost, and we add up all the market markups way up to the retail markup. You can see the retail markup is quite significant. By the time it's getting to the retailer, they're adding 15 shillings from the landed cost and from all the other market builds up. So once the market calculations have been done, the product lands, a packet of 8 lands at 52 shillings. This is for a low-end product. So it's come from 29 shillings to 52 shillings. And this is before we add VAT. So depending on the tax treatment, the VAT treatment that you selected, there's a VAT that is applicable here. Like in this case, you can see that there's a VAT for us here. There's a VAT that we are working with is 16%. So after adding the markup, the market markups, which are quite significant, the client pays an extra 8 shillings, and the product lands at 61 shillings. This is for a low-end cost product. If you can recall, by the time this was landing at the port of entry, it was 25. After it's gone through the value chain, it comes to 61. So you can begin to see how the costs play out and how they begin to build up to the time they get to the consumer. So this other worksheet again does the same thing, but here we are looking at locally manufactured products. So we are looking at what the COGS are and seeing the proportion of tax, the proportion of cost that goes into each of the elements of production. The worksheet again is automatically generated. We have built-in formulas, so you need not calculate anything from this cost. It's pulling significantly from the input worksheets. So again, if there's anything that you need to change on this worksheet, then you need to go back to the foundational worksheets and do the data collection from there. So here, this slide begins by giving an estimated cost of COGS. It's 40 shillings. Chris had mentioned that. And then the tax classification, I believe, Chris, also was done from the foundational worksheets. Yes. So we had picked exempt, and that's what we are working with. This is for imported raw materials. And then when it is exempt, you can see automatically the spreadsheet works out that VAT is not recoverable when the policy design is exempt. And from here on, it begins now to make the actual calculations, drawing from the cost of COGS from a pack of 8 locally manufactured pads, and shows what proportion of cost go into each specific production element. I won't go through all of them, but as a highlight, maybe I could begin by looking at the materials, the main input materials that take up a significant amount of cost at 52%, and understandably so. So half of the cost of a pack of 8 lies within the core raw materials. So that's the pulp, the fluff pulp, the sap, the top sheets. So all the elements that go into the actual production of the product. And then there's a cost element. So we also looked at what proportion of the cost of the COGS is being contributed to by packaging, by labor, warehousing, factory overheads, and we give the percentage proportion that is attributed to the COGS, and then we give an absolute amount in terms of shillings that is attributed to that specific element. Once you're done, once the worksheet calculates that for you, it goes to the next section where it looks at whether there's VAT applicable on the elements of production. So that's the core elements of production. Chris, if you could go just slightly higher. Yeah. So this is what you're seeing here. So it's telling you that there's VAT incurred on raw materials, on packaging and warehousing at 16%, and then it calculates the corresponding cost, the corresponding cost in absolute shillings. And so for the case of Kenya, you can see, or for the case of this scenario, you can see that there's 5 shillings that cannot be reclaimed that unfortunately will be embedded in the final cost of the product. From there on, then we go to the taxes and levies and levies and tariffs that are applicable. Again, based on what you had input in your foundational worksheet, it picks up the percentage that is applicable within the country, and then it calculates that against the cost of COGS, and you can see how that plays out. Like, for example, if there's import duty on raw materials, that comes in at 10%. So that adds about 2 shillings and 51 cents to a pack of 8 in Kenya. And then you will recall when we looked at the imported goods, this was a cost that was not there. So you begin to see how the costs play out between the two categories. At the end of it, it gives us what the factory cost is ex VAT. So you remember, so it comes to 37 shillings before we add the embedded cost. We have an embedded cost of 5 shillings. So the cost of the COGS at the factory gate before any markups are put gets to 42 shillings. So you can begin to see where and how the costs are adding up. So once we have our factory cost, then the product now begins to calculate other costs that are attributed downstream, such as any markups by the market, and also VAT at the till, if that's applicable. So we start with the manufacturer's markup after the product has been fully produced. We estimated that at 15%. I think that's standard with industry, and also from what we heard from the various manufacturers that we spoke to, it goes down to the retail markup. Again, the retail markup is quite significant, especially when the product is going through the informal sector. So there's a lot of taxes that get embedded before the product, the consumer can access the product. So depending on what you had selected again in your input sheets, there's VAT that is applicable or not. So our locally manufactured product has come in from 40 shillings, which was the cost of goods, and by the time it's reaching the consumer is at 65 shillings. If there was a VAT that is chargeable at the port of entry, you would see how that would also add on to the final cost of the product. And then I think one thing that also I think would be important for us to mention is that cost of goods is data that is a bit complicated and difficult to collect from manufacturers. We had to speak to a couple of manufacturers for us to triangulate that data and land to the proportions that we are using. So feel free to speak to a couple of sources so that you can be able to have a full picture of what's happening. You can go out and do the market observation and see what prices look like at the till, and put all this information together for you to come up with close to accurate estimations for your locally manufactured products.
Yeah, and further to add, as Rita has gone through and outlined some of the data inputs that are required and some of the assumptions that were made, as well as the concepts underpinning that work, as this analysis can become quickly quite complicated. It requires a comprehensive market analysis, and it takes some time to go through and understand the existing data, to confirm assumptions, to develop assumptions. and talk to key stakeholders and players that may not always be willing to share information and data. So just be prepared as you work through the tool itself, that there is an investment of resources, time, energy, and thought that's required to ensure that you're coming up with estimates that are quite viable. And just to say as well that the quality of the assumptions and the inputs will obviously drive the quality of the outputs, the estimates that we end up in terms of the pass-through. Okay, Rita, back to you and
Yeah.
to the scenarios slide.
So, after working through the cost stack, this lands us at an exciting place. So, this is the scenario worksheet, and this is we like to call it your what if worksheet, because it helps you model and look at different policy scenarios and what that would mean to the final product. So we starting with the topmost row, we have taken the treatment for imported and locally manufactured products separately. There are three options in both tabs that you can work through. Chris, if you could just go through one drop down, you can choose between three possible options of standard to zero rated, or standard to exempt, or standard to or exempt to zero rated. So those are the three possible scenarios. Again, play around with them so that you get different result analysis that you can use for the advocacy work and modeling. Once you've chosen the VAT treatment, then you work down to taxes and reforms. And based on what your country taxes are for these specific areas, you can work to reduce them and see how that plays out in regards to reduction in the consumer price. For example, for this specific analysis, we reduce taxes from 10%. We assume that taxes will reduce from 10% to zero. And then we've removed all our para tariff just to see how the numbers would play out in regards to prices. And one other key element that is very critical when you're working through your scenario worksheet is the pass-through. Chris spoke about the pass-through and how that will ultimately affect the cost of product at the retail outlet. You can choose if you choose no. If you choose not to override the pass-through, then you will work with our assumptions, which is that 75% of pass-through gets to the consumer through the formal trade, and 40% through the informal trade. If you wish to override that and put in a figure close to what's applicable in your respective context, then override that and put yes. Override pass-through and put yes. It will give you an option. It will give you an option for you to enter the data that is more favorable with you. Also very critical in calculating the cost, the final cost, and the equity measure is where the product is being purchased. Is it through the formal sector or the informal sector, and what proportion is that for both the poor and the non-poor? And I'll hand it back to Chris for him to now begin to see how the scenario page works out in terms of results and in terms of calculating other equity measures downstream.
Yeah, so thanks, Rita. So this page, what we're looking at now, highlights and summarizes what we would estimate to be the pass-through of any shifts in policy, any reductions in taxes, or the elimination of VAT on the impact to the user, to the purchaser of the end product. I just want to highlight again that these are estimates. These are not perfect numbers, but they are estimates that are based on viable assumptions, based on what we see globally in other markets, as well as what we understand from the analysis of the Kenya market in particular. So what we will see, I'll just take you through generally the orientation so you can get an understanding. So for the imported single-use disposables, again, we've looked at imported pads, both low cost as well as high cost, as well as domestically or locally manufactured. products as well. We looked at the impact of the channel, that is formal channels versus informal channels, and again, refer to the report for a definition of what those elements are. The baseline price is what we expect to see before the analysis is done. So this is at time zero, before any changes are made. The reform price reaching the consumer is the estimated price that actually the consumer will pay after these changes are made. But there's two key important differentiators. One is the total absolute reduction in the price. That is what we would expect to see if all of those policy reforms were made and translated to the end user, but also what we would estimate the pass-through actually reaching the consumer here, which is typically less than the total absolute reduction. And that is again because markets are often working inefficiently, especially in lower and middle income countries. And some of these delays are shifts in policy can result in delayed impact to the end user as well. So the estimated reduction in the price to user is this, in this case, 16% reduction in price or cost to the end user, which is not insignificant. But we see here that only 75% of that total cost was what we would estimate to reach users in the formal sector, but it's actually much less than that in the informal sector. And that has pretty significant implications for lower income populations as well. The same analysis is done for locally manufactured products. Read the report for the full analysis, but again, we see a big difference in tax implications and policy shifts for both locally manufactured versus importers. It's something that really it takes time to both consider, but it's an important factor in considering any of these changes. And I think is probably one of the more significant insights that came out of the report is policy shifts in policy impact importers much differently than domestic manufacturers. So this will give you an idea of the absolute pass-through to the end user, but we also looked at the shifts from an equitable standpoint. So this is really important as well because many times any shifts in policy, they're aiming to support use and equitable use by lower income populations. But what we see is based on that are somewhat arbitrary and subjective benchmark of 0.5%, what becomes affordable for users versus not, pre-reform and post-reform. The tool is set up to flag anything in red, that is anything that's more than 0.5% for the end user. And this is the baseline cost before any reform and the baseline cost after reform. And what we can see is some improvements, significant improvements, in fact, in affordability for especially higher income folks, but also for lowest income individuals and populations. But a key thing to really factor in is that even with very progressive policy shifts in taxation, menstrual health products still remain unaffordable for the lowest income quintiles. If we're looking at the model, looks at modeling elements that include partial use as well. So products begin to become much more affordable, even for lower income populations if partial use. So if they're only using half the number of products that are typically needed, and is often the case as menstruators extend use by reusing them or washing them out or making use of them longer than appropriate. But that also has health implications and risks there as well. So this will give you an idea, and it's also important for stakeholders to understand is that the impact from an equitable standpoint as well. Finally, the last measure that the tool produces is what we refer to as the benefit to cost ratio for both imported products as well as locally manufactured products. So complicated concept, but essentially what the benefit to cost ratio does is it compares the benefits that received by lower income households through any price savings or reductions in costs to the fiscal cost to the government in terms of VAT revenue that's foregone, especially from higher income populations. And so when a government is making any decision from a policy perspective, what we'd like to see is that any shifts in policy actually do have a pro income benefit to end users. Here in this example, and again, read the full report, anything that's higher than zero point 0.5 is deemed as being fairly having um, a positive impact on lower income populations as well. So dig deeper in that, but that can be a useful measure and tool and advocacy measure in terms of advocating for responsible um, impact and shifts in policy and change. So that is the tool itself. I want to encourage you to go to the full report, go back to the core revenues, to the webinars to really understand some of these underlying concepts and some of the underlying findings of the work itself. Um, and if you have any specific questions, I think that both my email address as well as Rita's email address is available on the RHSC website. We'd be happy to talk you through the actual use of the tool itself and the application to your country as well. So many thanks to RHSC for supporting this work. And thanks for Rita for being a great colleague and helping us understand the implications of any of these shifts in policy. Um,
Thanks, Chris.
yeah. Thank you very much and have a great day.